It started with a glass of bourbon, a reckless dare, and a girl who didn't even know she was being watched. Alexander Blake had never lost a game, not in business, not in courtrooms, not in bed. He wasn't the kind of man who asked questions. He was the kind who gave orders and expected the world to adjust. That night, in a private lounge 50 floors above Manhattan, surrounded by billionaires too rich to feel guilt, someone threw out a challenge they didn't think he'd take seriously. Nolan Bishop, longtime friend and occasional troublemaker, was the first to laugh. "You've done it all, Alex. The supermodels, the diplomats, the actresses who needed NDAs. What's left to prove?" Alexander didn't even look up. He poured himself another drink, ice clinking against crystal like distant thunder. Nolan tapped on his phone, swiped to a security feed, still paused on a grainy image. "She works in your building, does laundry and linens for the penthouse floors. They say she's Amish." That word made someone chuckle. "In New York? No way." Nolan grinned, flipping the screen around. "She left her community 2 months ago, something about caring for an aunt who's sick. But she's still living like one of them, still wears the bonnet, still walks like she's holding something sacred inside her." Alexander finally glanced over. The girl in the photo wasn't striking at first glance. She wore a plain blue-gray dress, her hair pinned back tightly, her posture rigid but poised. She was carrying a bundle of sheets, walking through the lobby as if the marble floors didn't impress her. Alexander's gaze narrowed slightly. "She looks young." "She's legal, 22, name's Rebecca Yoder." "And untouched?" Nolan smirked. "Untouched, unkissed, probably thinks passion is something you confess, not feel. Bet you can't even get her to look at you twice." Alexander swirled the bourbon slowly in his glass, the silence stretching until it became a decision. "What's the bet?" Nolan didn't hesitate. "One night, get her into your penthouse, get her to undress. No strings, no pressure, just one night. And if I win, 20% of the Halcyon deal, final." That made heads turn. Halcyon was worth $500 million. Even Alexander paused. "You really think I'll fail?" Nolan grinned. "I think you've never tried to seduce someone who wasn't already playing the same game." Alexander stood without a word, buttoned his jacket, tossed back the last of his drink like it was water. "Send me her schedule." The room laughed, but no one doubted he'd do it. He always did. What none of them knew, what not even Alexander himself understood yet, was that Rebecca Yoder wasn't the kind of girl you could tempt, or pressure, or corner. She wasn't quiet because she had nothing to say. She was silent because she had already heard too much. And when the moment came, when she stood in his penthouse surrounded by walls of glass and asked him calmly, "Is this what you do with your power?" he wouldn't feel like a man at all. He would feel like a boy undone, because Rebecca wouldn't be the one who surrendered that night. She would be the one who stood steady as he fell. And in the silence between her breath and her bravery, Alexander Blake would lose the one thing he never expected: himself. Rebecca Yoder had never seen the inside of a skyscraper until the day she stepped off the Greyhound bus and stared up at the steel and glass tower that housed the laundry service where she had been offered work. She didn't flinch at the rush of taxis or the sharp scent of asphalt and exhaust, but inside, behind her calm expression, everything felt foreign. Too loud, too fast, too exposed. She came from a world where Sundays were for stillness, where technology was forbidden, where the sound of a horse's hooves on dirt roads was more common than a car horn. Her family still lived on a farm 3 hours outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and even though she hadn't spoken to them in over 62 days, she still carried their silence like it was stitched into her skin. She had left the Amish community not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. Her aunt, who had long since chosen to live English, as they called it, had been diagnosed with aggressive lung disease. She needed someone to help with her breathing treatments, her food, her appointments. Rebecca volunteered without hesitation. She had always been the quiet one, the one who helped before she was asked, the one who made quilts and read by candlelight and hummed hymns instead of dancing. She wasn't naive. She knew the world outside was louder, faster, and far less forgiving, but she had promised to help, and promises meant more to her than comfort. When her aunt passed 3 weeks after Rebecca arrived, she stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, her family would have welcomed her back, eventually, but because something about the noise and speed of the outside world had begun to awaken something she hadn't known was asleep. Curiosity, not for sin or vice, but for possibility. She didn't want to be invisible her whole life. She didn't want to marry a man because her bishop approved. She didn't want to wake up at 50 and wonder who she could have been, so she kept the clothes, wore the simple dress, kept her hair covered, but she found a job through a local community center, laundering and pressing linens for luxury clients in Midtown Manhattan. The work was honest. Her hands ached at night. She earned enough to pay for a rented room in Queens, and even a little more to buy secondhand books, ones she hid in a drawer so the other women at the boarding house wouldn't ask questions. She liked poetry. She liked knowing the world had things to say that weren't sermons. Rebecca didn't look people in the eye when she walked, not because she was shy, but because she had been taught that humility meant not inviting attention. And yet, attention always found her. Her presence had a kind of quiet force. In a world full of noise, silence became its own rebellion. Alexander Blake noticed her first on a Monday evening. He was walking through the service corridor on the 30th floor, taking a shortcut while on a call. She was wheeling a cart of folded sheets down the opposite end. He saw only her back at first, the way she walked, straight and unhurried, like she wasn't rushing to prove anything. When she passed him, she didn't look up. No reaction, no recognition, just a slight nod, polite, firm, gone in an instant. He wasn't used to that. Everyone looked. Everyone smiled or blushed or whispered, but she kept her eyes on the hallway, like she had decided long ago not to let anyone see what was behind them. He didn't ask about her immediately. He had other things to manage: board meetings, mergers, the Halcyon deal, but something about her stayed in his mind, a shadow he couldn't shake. Later that week, he asked Nolan, casually, about the laundry staff rotation. Nolan had access to everything. The moment he pulled up her file and said the word Amish, everything clicked. That was why she felt different, not just innocent, untouched in a way that wasn't about sex, untouched by ambition, untouched by the poison of wanting to be seen. Alexander had grown up surrounded by power. His father was a brutal man, a financier who believed in control above all else. Emotions were weaknesses, feelings were liabilities. As a boy, Alexander had learned to listen before he spoke, to read before he trusted, and to strike before anyone saw the opening. He had become a billionaire by 29, built Blake & Rowe from nothing but a vision and a willingness to burn bridges before crossing them. He didn't do romance. He didn't believe in soulmates. He believed in leverage. But lately, even leverage bored him. He had won every game, closed every deal, slept with every kind of woman, beautiful, brilliant, broken. None of them stayed. He didn't ask them to. He thought that meant he was in control. Until the night Nolan made that bet. Alexander didn't need the money. He didn't need the ego boost. What he needed, though, he didn't realize it yet, was the challenge of something real. Someone who wouldn't bend. Someone whose yes actually meant something because she still believed in the power of no. He didn't know that Rebecca didn't believe in games, that she had never even kissed anyone, not out of fear, but out of reverence. He didn't know that she read Rilke under the covers at night and whispered verses to herself when the world felt too loud. He didn't know that her silence wasn't weakness, it was armor, and the only thing strong enough to break his. But he was about to find out, because the first time he spoke to her, She looked him in the eye with a stillness that made his chest tighten. She didn't smile, she didn't tremble, she simply said, "If this is some kind of game, I hope you're ready to lose." Alexander had never been told no without it sounding like a challenge, but the way Rebecca said it, soft, steady, without edge or flirtation, landed like a door quietly shutting. And still, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Not because she resisted him, but because she didn't even seem to register him as something to resist. She wasn't immune to his charm. She just lived in a world where charm didn't mean anything. Over the next few days, he saw her more than he should have, passing in the lobby, loading laundry carts into service elevators, always with her head down, her focus tight, her movements precise, no makeup, no heels, no game. He caught himself checking the time she arrived and adjusting his schedule to cross her path. It was stupid. He had a deal with the Koreans on the verge of collapse, a startup founder threatening to back out. His calendar was packed, but his mind kept drifting. He approached her again in the service corridor late Thursday. She was folding sheets on a long steel table, her hair tied back neatly, hands moving with the quiet confidence of repetition. He leaned against the wall. "Do you ever get tired of doing the same thing over and over?" She looked up once, briefly, then returned to folding. "It's honest work," she said. "That doesn't answer the question." "I don't think the question was honest," she replied. "You didn't come here for conversation." He smirked, but it faded fast. "Maybe I did." She paused, her fingers still on the edge of a sheet. "Why?" He hesitated. "You intrigue me." "That's not a reason," she said. "That's a word men use when they're bored and trying to feel something." That caught him off guard. She didn't say it with judgment, just clarity, as if she had already taken the measure of him and found it irrelevant. "What do you see when you look at me?" he asked. She looked at him then, really looked. A man who's used to being the center of every room, who's never been ignored long enough to wonder if he deserves the attention. He didn't know what to say to that, so he left. For the first time in years, someone walked away from him without trying to follow. That night, he lay in his penthouse bed and stared at the ceiling, the city lights pouring in through floor-to-ceiling glass. He wasn't angry. He was curious, not the kind of curiosity that made him want to possess her, the kind that made him want to understand what it meant to be so unshaken in a world designed to break people. The bet wasn't forgotten. Nolan asked him 2 days later if he had won yet. Alexander didn't answer, because it didn't feel like a game anymore. It felt like standing in front of something sacred with dirty hands. He started staying late in the office, not because of work, but because Rebecca's shift usually ended after midnight. He never admitted it to himself, but every time he heard the squeak of her cartwheels down the hall, he felt something settle in his chest, like quiet returning to a room after too much noise. One night, a sudden thunderstorm rolled over Manhattan. The city flickered with lightning. Elevator service froze temporarily on the upper floors. Rebecca was stuck on 49. He found her by accident, or maybe not seated near a window, watching the skyline light up with each flash. She didn't move when he entered, just glanced over and said, "It's beautiful from this high." He nodded, taking a slow step forward. Most people don't notice. They're too busy looking down. Or at themselves, she added. He sat in the chair beside her, not close, not touching, just near. They didn't speak for several minutes. Just silence, shared, not awkward, not empty. It had shape. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. "I wasn't supposed to notice you." "I wasn't trying to be noticed," she replied. "That's probably why I did." She looked at him carefully then. "You're not who I expected either." "And what did you expect?" "More arrogance. Less quiet." He exhaled, a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "What if I told you the bet was real, that I stood in a room full of men and said I could take your innocence in one night?" She didn't flinch, just stared at him with the same steady gaze. "I'd believe you." "You're not angry?" "Disappointed," she said, "not because you said it, but because you thought it mattered." That stunned him more than yelling would have. "And what would matter?" She didn't answer right away. "Seeing me, not what you can take, not what I can give, just seeing me, like I'm not here to fix something broken in you." He wanted to reach for her then, not to touch, just to feel her presence closer, but he didn't. Instead, he asked, "And what do you see in me?" She was quiet a long time. Then she said, "A man who's trying to remember who he was before he became the person people expect him to be." Something inside him cracked open. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of surrender. That weekend, he didn't go to his Hamptons house. He stayed in the city, wandering, thinking. Monday morning, he saw her again in the lobby. She was coming in early, her dress slightly damp from rain, her hair pulled back tighter than usual. He said nothing, just opened the door for her. She blinked, surprised. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's why it matters." They began talking more after that, quiet moments in hallways, shared glances in the laundry room. Once, she found a paperback book left on her cart, Neruda poems, no note. Just page 34, dog-eared. She didn't ask if it was him. She knew. He never pushed, never flirted, just watched, learned. She didn't know how deeply he was unraveling, that he was beginning to look forward to silence, that her calm was becoming an anchor. She didn't know that his heart sped up every time she said his name, not like a servant, but like a person who didn't owe him anything. One night, the elevator stalled between floors during a test reset. Just the two of them inside. He laughed softly. "Trapped with me. Must be your nightmare." She didn't smile. "I don't mind silence." "Even mine?" "Especially yours," she said. He turned to her then, fully, for the first time. Not with intention, not with control, just with something raw in his eyes. "Rebecca," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted this to be a game, not after I met you. I thought I could win something, but the truth is, I've never been more willing to lose." She stepped closer, not much, just enough. Her voice was steady. "You can't take something I haven't given." "Then why are you still here?" he asked. She looked at him with a softness he hadn't earned yet, but desperately wanted to. "Because I want to be seen, not stolen." When the elevator doors opened, neither of them moved for a full 3 seconds. That silence said everything they couldn't. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He stood at the window of his penthouse, watching the city that had always made him feel invincible. Now, it just felt quiet, and he wasn't afraid of it anymore. He knew, deep in his chest, that the bet was over. Not because he had lost, but because something far more dangerous had happened. He had surrendered. The shift came slowly, not in a single moment, but across small gestures and quiet acknowledgments. Alexander no longer waited for Rebecca to speak first. He didn't need her to prove anything. He had started learning her rhythm, the way she nodded slightly when thinking, the way her hands moved in prayer even when she wasn't aware. It was Monday evening when she brought him coffee, something she had never done before. Not because it was her job, it wasn't, but because she had overheard a conversation with his assistant about a meeting running too long. He looked at the cup, then at her, and said nothing for a long beat. Then quietly, "Thank you." She didn't reply, just turned and left. The next morning, he asked if she'd walk with him during his lunch break. No driver, no bodyguards, just him in a dark sweater and jeans, a rare choice for a man whose closet could rival a designer showroom. She said yes. They walked 2 blocks in silence. Then she said, "You don't look like yourself today." He glanced down at his clothes. "Maybe I'm trying not to be. Or maybe you're finally being." That stuck with him. They passed a florist's cart on the sidewalk. Without thinking, he bought a single white daisy and handed it to her. "Why a daisy?" she asked. "Because it doesn't try too hard." "Like me?" she teased. "Like truth," he said. "It just exists." Later that afternoon, he was called into a crisis meeting with the board. He nearly forgot about the flower until he found it pressed between the pages of a book she left for him the next day. Rebecca didn't flirt, she didn't play games, but she left pieces of herself behind like small anchors, and Alexander, once master of strategy, found himself lost in the calmest storm he'd ever known. That Friday, she didn't show up. Her supervisor said she called in sick. It shouldn't have mattered. She wasn't his. She wasn't part of his world. But by midnight, he was pacing his penthouse, staring at his phone. He didn't even have her number. All he had was the sense that something was missing. The next morning, he went to the hotel basement, not the penthouse, not the executive office, but the janitorial floor. He knocked once on the staff break room. The door opened slowly. Rebecca stood there, surprised. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I wasn't expecting—" "You weren't at work." "I wasn't feeling well." "You still aren't," he said, looking at her pale face. "Can I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. The room was small, 2 metal lockers, a microwave, a Bible on the shelf. A folded quilt on the bench told him she had been sleeping here some nights. He sat on the bench, silent. Then finally, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it's not your burden." "Then make it mine," he said. She looked at him, then down at her hands. "My father left when I was 13. My mother died a year later. The community raised me. I did what I could. I never went to high school, never had a phone, never kissed anyone. The bishop's family offered to marry me into theirs. I ran. I didn't want to be chosen. I wanted to choose." He listened without moving. "And you came here. Because it was far, because no one would find me." "They're looking for you?" "Not anymore," she said. "Once a girl leaves, she's erased." Alexander exhaled slowly. "And yet, you're still whole." "Not whole," she said, "but not owned." He stood slowly and walked to her. Not close, not yet, just enough for her to see that he wasn't afraid of her truth. "Rebecca," he said, "do you know what you did to me?" She blinked. "Nothing." "Exactly," he said. "You didn't chase me. You didn't pretend. You didn't bend, and that destroyed everything I thought power looked like." She stepped forward, then, inches away. "And what does it look like now?" "You," he said simply, "telling the truth in a world that rewards lies." They stood there, the air between them charged and quiet. Then she asked, "Would you still want me if there were no bet? No dare? No chase?" "I only want you," he said, "because there was nothing to win." She reached up, touched his cheek with her fingers, soft, trembling. "I've never been touched like this," she whispered. "Not by someone who didn't want to take something." He rested his forehead against hers. "And I've never wanted to give more." He didn't kiss her. He didn't pull her in. He simply stayed there, breathing with her, letting the silence speak what their bodies hadn't yet. When she finally stepped back, her hand slipped into his. "If I let you in," she said softly, "promise me you won't look away." "I've only just started seeing," he replied. That night they didn't go to his penthouse. They went to a small suite 2 floors down. No glass walls, no city lights, just soft yellow bulbs and cotton sheets. She undressed slowly, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with something closer to defiance, as if to say, "This is me, no veil, no filter, no shame." And when he saw her, he didn't smile or groan or gawk. He breathed, just breathed like he hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath for years. She was not perfect, she was real. Soft in places she didn't know how to love yet, strong in the places life had hardened. He undressed too, but slowly, as if peeling away decades of ego. There were no moans, no fireworks, no performance, just reverence. When his hands touched her waist, he paused. "You can stop me any time," he said. "I won't," she whispered. "I'm not afraid anymore." He kissed her shoulder, then her ribs, then the scar near her knee she had once been ashamed of. When their bodies met, it was like two pieces of a story that had waited years to find the same page. There was no rush, no agenda, just presence. Afterward, she lay curled against him, her breath quiet, her hand resting over his heart. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said. "I unlearn everything the world taught me about winning, because losing myself in you might be the first honest thing I've ever done." They didn't sleep. They just lay there, two strangers who had become something sacred. In the morning, he woke to find her already dressed, sitting by the window, wrapped in the hotel blanket. "You left the door open," he said, "because I didn't want you to think I was hiding." "You never have," he said, rising. "It's me who's been hiding all this time." Later that day, he canceled every meeting. He told his assistant to clear the week. Then he took Rebecca to the flower district. They didn't buy anything. They just walked, and he watched her as she studied every bloom like she hadn't been allowed to choose beauty before. At one point, she looked back at him and said, "You're still in a suit." "It's who I was," he said. "I'm not sure who I'll be now." She smiled softly. "Whoever you become, don't let the world steal it again." And he nodded, because in her he had found the courage to surrender. The morning after, something had shifted not between them, but around them. The air felt heavier, like the world outside that hotel room knew something sacred had occurred and was preparing to take it away. Alexander had barely touched his phone in 12 hours. That alone would have shocked his board into silence. But now, as Rebecca stood near the window, the sunlight soft against her skin, he realized nothing on his calendar mattered more than the way she looked when she believed she wasn't being watched. She hadn't spoken much since they left the flower district. She didn't need to. Her presence filled spaces words never could. But silence had its limits, and outside that room, reality had teeth. It started with a photo, a blurry image of Alexander at the market, standing too close to a woman in plain clothes. Then another, her face partially turned, but recognizable to anyone who had seen her even once. The gossip blogs didn't wait for confirmation. Headlines spread like fire. "Billionaire caught in secret affair with unknown woman." "CEO's mystery girl. Is he giving up the game?" Comments flooded in. Some called her a distraction, others worse. The cruelest ones said she was playing innocent, using her simplicity as a strategy. Alexander read every line in silence. His PR team begged for a statement. He gave none. Because what could he say? That she wasn't a game? That she had undone years of carefully constructed detachment without even trying? Rebecca didn't see the news until the following evening. She had gone to her shift at the hotel like nothing had changed, not knowing her face was being passed around every major outlet. When she entered the laundry room, one of the other girls, nervous and wide-eyed, handed her a printed article. Rebecca read in silence, her lips parting, but no sound coming out. Then she folded the paper slowly and walked out. Alexander found her standing outside the staff entrance, arms wrapped around herself. Her first words weren't questions. They weren't accusations. They were worse. "You told me you'd protect this." His throat tightened. "I didn't tell them anything." "But they knew," she said, her voice low, trembling. They found me. They used me. I didn't even know I was being watched. I'll fix it, he said quickly. No, she interrupted. You can't fix this like a business deal. She turned and walked down the street. He followed, but she didn't stop. Not until they reached a quiet alley behind the hotel. There, she finally faced him. Do you know what it's like to build your entire life on silence? To be taught that your value lies in what you hide, not what you show. He nodded, slowly. Yes, that's why I saw you. Then why didn't you guard me like something sacred? She asked. He had no answer, because he hadn't. Not really. He had brought her into his orbit, but hadn't considered how close the fire would come. She stared at him for a long beat. You let them see me before I was ready. He could have explained, could have reminded her that it wasn't his fault, but he didn't. Because she was right. In the world he lived in, nothing stayed untouched for long. The next day, she didn't show up for work. By noon, she wasn't answering her messages. By nightfall, she was gone from the hotel entirely. The manager said she'd packed a single bag and left before sunrise. Alexander sat in his car outside the staff entrance for an hour, waiting, hoping, but she didn't return. Instead, he stared at the note she left behind. 8 words, written in clean, careful script. I need to remember who I was before you. He read it over and over. He didn't sleep that night. He walked through his penthouse, each room echoing with her absence. She had only been there once, briefly, and yet the space felt emptier than ever. A week passed, then 2. His board noticed his distraction. Blake noticed too. You really let her walk away? He asked during a late-night meeting. Over what? A few rumors? Alexander didn't respond. Blake continued. You said it yourself. She was a dare, a challenge, nothing more. That was before, Alexander said quietly. Before what? Blake asked. Before she changed everything. The second week, Alexander disappeared from the press. No parties, no events, just silence. The gossip blog speculated he was hiding from scandal. Others said he was off the grid to manage fallout. But the truth was simpler. He wasn't hiding. He was searching. Her records were minimal. No phone, no bank account, no ID under her current name. The only clue he had was a single line she had once whispered in his bed. I used to draw by the river when I was a girl. He took that memory and followed it. 3 hours north of the city, near a small Amish settlement now quiet and half-deserted, there was a river. And by that river, a church converted into a community center, long since abandoned. That's where he found her, sitting on the porch steps with a sketch pad on her knees and her hair tied back in a simple braid. She didn't look up when he approached. You came, she said. Of course I did, he replied. I didn't know if you would. I didn't know if I deserved to, he said. She turned then, her eyes unreadable. You don't have to apologize. You just have to understand. I do, he said. Now, more than ever. She studied him. Why now? Because I've seen what life feels like without you in it, he said. And it's quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It's empty. She stood slowly, her sketchpad falling closed. I didn't leave because I stopped feeling, she said. I left because I started to. And what are you feeling now? He asked. She stepped closer. Like maybe I'm not the only one who was learning how to trust. They didn't kiss. Not then. They just stood close, the distance between them shrinking not by force, but by choice. That night, he didn't drive back to the city. He stayed, sleeping on the wooden floor beside her in the church's old prayer, ici, listening to her breath in the dark. She talked in whispers, about her childhood, about leaving, about why she had never let anyone touch her, not because she feared them, but because she feared what she'd feel afterward. "With you," she said quietly, "I didn't feel smaller. I felt seen." He took her hand. "With you, I didn't feel like a man who had everything. I felt like a man who finally had something real." The next morning they walked by the river. No cameras, no security, just wind and water and the sound of birds. She smiled for the first time in days. He reached for her hand again. This time, she didn't hesitate. Back in the city, the noise hadn't died down. But Alexander didn't care. He made a statement not through PR or interviews, but through action. He brought her back to his world, not hidden, not ashamed, but by his side. When reporters asked about her, he said only one thing. "The woman you called a mistake is the only decision I've never doubted." He introduced her at his next shareholder dinner. She didn't wear designer, she didn't wear makeup, she wore a simple dress, her hair in a braid, and stood taller than anyone else in the room. When the whispers began, she didn't flinch, because she knew who she was now. Not just a girl who had left everything behind, but someone who had stepped into her own story. Not because someone saved her, but because someone finally saw her and chose not to look away. It should have been enough. Standing by his side, no longer hidden, no longer misnamed. She had returned, and the world had seen it. But life wasn't that generous. And love, when real, didn't always shield you from consequence. 2 weeks after Rebecca stepped back into Alexander's world, a story dropped not on gossip blogs this time, but on a legacy outlet. A long-form piece titled "The Man Who Took the Amish Girl." It was worse than anything before, not because it was sensational, but because it was calculated. Photos of Rebecca's old home, interviews with distant relatives she hadn't seen in years, phrases like purity culture and exploitation printed in cold black ink. One headline read, "Is this a romance or a reckoning?" She read every word in silence, sitting on the edge of Alexander's leather couch, the same place where she had once curled up beside him without fear. But now the silence felt different. It wasn't theirs. It was the world's. He walked in 10 minutes later, saw the screen on her tablet, and froze. "I didn't know it would go that far," he said. "I didn't think they'd find your past." She looked up. "You didn't think they'd care because you never had to hide from anything." He stepped closer, but she didn't move. "You said I could trust you with this," she continued, her voice tight. "You said what happened between us wouldn't make me small." "It didn't," he replied. "It made everything else feel small by comparison." "Then why does it feel like I'm being erased by your presence?" she asked. "Why is the world more interested in who I was before you touched me than who I've become since?" He had no answer, not a real one. Because the world didn't care about growth. It cared about spectacle. And the quiet girl from the farmland who had once walked barefoot to Sunday prayer had now become the punchline to a billionaire's latest headline. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. "Not you," she said after a long pause, "but I regret not protecting myself from what loving you would cost me." He reached for her hand. "Then let me protect you now." But she pulled away. "That's the problem," she said. "I don't want to be protected like a secret. I want to be respected like a partner." She stood, grabbed her coat, and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Back to who I was before all this taught me how cruel the truth could be," she answered. The door closed behind her, and he didn't follow. Not because he didn't want to, but because for the first time he understood that love didn't always mean chasing. Sometimes it meant standing still and hoping they'd return on their own terms. In the days that followed, he didn't issue statements. He didn't hold press conferences. He withdrew, not out of shame, but out of grief. He spent nights in his office, reviewing documents without reading them. His assistant noticed the change. The rest of the staff whispered quietly. He stopped attending events. He canceled a keynote. Blake called 3 times. Alexander didn't answer, but every night before locking the office, he took out the folded drawing she had once left in his room, a sketch of 2 hands almost touching. It had no signature, no title, but now it felt like the only truth left. 3 weeks passed. Then, on a Friday morning, he got a call from someone he didn't expect, Rebecca's younger cousin, Hannah. "She's back home," the girl said quietly. "Not at the community house, but the river, the one she used to draw at." "Why are you calling me?" he asked. "Because she doesn't cry in front of people," Hannah whispered. "But last night she did." The gravel road was longer than he remembered. The trees looked taller, like they were guarding something sacred. When he reached the bend near the water, he saw her, sitting on the edge of the dock, legs crossed, hair loose in the wind, a notebook in her lap. She didn't look up when he stepped onto the wood, but she didn't flinch either. "You found me?" she said. "You wanted me to." "Not at first," she admitted. "At first I wanted to disappear." He sat beside her. "Then why are you still drawing?" "Because disappearing isn't the same as erasing." They sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "I read the article again." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I wanted to see if there was anything in it that still made me ashamed," he replied. "And there wasn't." "Not even how they described me?" she asked. "Especially how they described you," he said, "because they only saw a girl they didn't understand. I saw the woman who taught me how to see in the first place." She looked at him, not with anger or sadness, but something deeper, a guarded hope. "You still want me?" she asked. "Not for protection, not for distraction, but for partnership?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded page. It wasn't a contract. It was the original sketch. But now the hands touched, just barely. Her breath caught. "You redrew it?" "No," he said. "I just filled in the truth." "And what truth is that?" she whispered. "That I don't want a world where you have to hide just to be with me," he replied. "I want a world where you're beside me because you choose to be." "And if I say yes?" she asked. "Then I'll spend every day proving I'm not the man who mistook you for something I could control." He answered, "I'll be the one who earns the right to stay." She said nothing for a long time. The wind rustled the trees. The river moved quietly. Then she reached for his hand and held it. Not tight, not desperate, just honest. "I don't need the city," she said, "but I need to know that I won't be lost in it again." "You won't be," he promised, "because I won't let you fade." The next day they returned to the city, not in secret, not in fear. This time they walked into the building together, no disguises, no avoidance. When a reporter asked, "Is this the girl from the headlines?" Alexander said calmly, "No, this is the woman I almost lost because I forgot that the truth deserves more than silence." He didn't put her back in a box. He didn't give her a desk in the corner or assign her a title to justify her presence. Instead, he offered her something better, a gallery. A space in the city where young artists could draw without judgment, create without limitation. And at the front of the gallery, a plaque with her name. Rebecca, the one who reminded us that some things aren't meant to be understood, only seen. 6 months later, the city had moved on. The headlines had faded, but inside that gallery, something permanent bloomed. Art, love, memory, and in the center of it all, a girl who was once mistaken for something she wasn't now fully herself, and beside her, the man who had once bet he could take everything she had, only to discover she was the one who gave him something he never knew he needed. It didn't end in fireworks. There was no cinematic kiss on a rooftop, no viral photo to reclaim her name. What they had now was quieter than all of that, but stronger too. It began with a morning like any other. Rebecca stood by the wide windows of the gallery, sunlight catching the curls of her hair, her hands smudged with charcoal from a sketch she hadn't finished yet. Alexander leaned against the doorframe, coffee in hand, watching her in silence. Not the kind of silence they used to weaponize against the world, but the kind that felt like home. "You're up early," she said without turning. "I never really sleep when you're not beside me," he replied. She smiled faintly, still not looking. "That's unhealthy." "That's true," he said, walking closer. "But it's honest." She finally turned to face him. "You never liked honesty before." "No," he agreed, "I didn't. But you made it feel like a relief, not a risk." She studied him, that look in her eyes still equal parts wonder and wariness, as if part of her still didn't believe he could be real, or stay real. "I used to think being seen would ruin me," she said, "but now I know being misunderstood is worse." He took the coffee from his hand and placed it on the table beside her. "I see you," he said simply. Not the headlines, not the body they tried to strip of dignity, not the mistake that brought us together, just you, with the quiet voice that doesn't need to shout to be heard. "And who are you now?" she asked almost playfully. "Still the man who bet he could break a girl like me in one night?" "No," he said, stepping close enough to feel her breath. "I'm the man who spent one night losing every part of his arrogance and never wanted it back." She didn't say anything at first, just reached out and touched the scar on his wrist, the one he never explained, the one she never asked about, because she knew by now that some stories are too sacred for explanation. They only exist in the way someone's breath catches, in the way their voice softens when they say a name like it's prayer, and in the way a man holds a woman not to possess her, but to remind her that she never had to be earned. When the gallery opened that morning, the first exhibit people saw wasn't her best drawing. It was the one she once sketched in silence, the two hands finally touching. No caption, no frame, just paper and pencil and truth. Some people paused, some moved on, but one couple stood longer than the rest. A young girl in a linen dress and a boy who looked like he hadn't learned how to speak yet without apologizing. She pointed at the sketch and whispered, "Do you think they found each other?" And the boy replied, "I think they never really let go." Rebecca watched from across the room, Alexander beside her. She didn't need to answer. She just reached for his hand, and this time he didn't flinch, because some stories begin with a mistake. But the ones that last, the ones that matter, are built slowly, quietly, and without shame. Not about innocence lost, but strength found. Not about conquest, but connection. And not about who touched who first, but who stayed when everything else tried to pull them apart. He once bet he could break her in a night. But she showed him that real power isn't taken. It's given, chosen, and never, ever forced. That was how they ended, not with surrender, but with belonging, not as opposites, but as equals. She was no longer the girl who was mistaken, and he was no longer the man who mistook her. They were just two people who saw each other fully and still chose to stay.